Now that we have successfully installed and started up Elasticsearch, let's take a short moment to explore the Elasticsearch directory. Let's begin by taking a look at what's inside the bin directory. Here we have a number of binary scripts. You saw one of them in the previous lecture, namely the Elasticsearch script that we used to start up Elasticsearch. There are a bunch of different helper utilities here. A couple worth mentioning are Elasticsearch plugin and Elasticsearch SQL CLI, which are used to install plugins and run Elasticsearch SQL queries, respectively. The next directory that we'll take a look at is the config directory. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this directory stores a number of configuration files where you can configure Elasticsearch. Let's begin by looking at the elasticsearch.yml file, which is the main configuration file for Elasticsearch. I won't go through all of the settings in here, but I will mention a couple of them. All of the settings within this file are commented out, meaning that default values are used, unless the settings are commented back in. It's best practice to specify the cluster name with the cluster.name setting. I haven't told you what a cluster is yet, so you can ignore this for now. The default value that's used if no value is specified here is Elasticsearch. The next setting is one named node.name. I also haven't told you what a node is yet, so just ignore this setting for now. Just know that it's best practice to specify a value here. We'll talk about what clusters and nodes are soon, at which point this will all make sense, so don't worry about it for now. The next section enables us to specify paths to various directories, namely the directories for storing data and logs. The default locations are within the Elasticsearch directory. You can configure this because for a production environment, it's good practice to store data, logs, and configuration files outside of the Elasticsearch directory. The reason for that is that you can then remove the entire Elasticsearch directory without losing valuable data. This is useful when upgrading Elasticsearch, and also just as a precautionary measure. Scrolling to the bottom of the file, we have some network-related settings. Specifically, you can configure Elasticsearch to bind to a different IP address, as well as specify a custom port. The default values are the machine's loopback address and port 9200. The discovery section is related to how multiple instances of Elasticsearch are connected, which is not relevant to us right now. Those were the settings that were worth mentioning for now. This file does not contain all of the available settings, but rather the most important ones. Moving on, we have a file named jvm.options. JVM is short for Java Virtual Machine. Since Elasticsearch is built with Java, it runs within a JVM, which has a certain amount of reserved memory. More specifically, the JVM's heap size. You can configure how much memory should be made available to Elasticsearch at the top of the file if you need to, with the default value being 1 GB. The rest of the settings are quite advanced, and I recommend that you don't change any of them unless you really know what you're doing. Elasticsearch uses the Log4j2 logging framework for writing various information to logs. This is the most popular logging framework for Java as far as I know. I'm not going to cover any of the settings in here, both because they are specific to the framework, and because I don't see any reason why you would change them. The rest of the files within the config directory are related to configuring users and roles. I'm not going to cover that here because it's highly recommended that users and roles are configured within Kibana instead of within configuration files. The JDK directory contains the OpenJDK that Elasticsearch ships with. JDK is short for Java Development Kit and is essentially the Java runtime that will be used by Elasticsearch, unless you have installed one yourself. The lib directory contains a number of dependencies that Elasticsearch needs, including the log4j logging framework and Apache Lucene, which Elasticsearch builds on top of. The modules directory contains a number of built-in modules that provide some additional functionality to Elasticsearch. These are enabled by default, so the purpose of them is just to have the code for a number of features self-contained. As you can see towards the end of the list, this is where the XPack features are located, for example. You will see a number of these modules in action throughout the course, although it's completely transparent to us that the functionality comes from a module. Last but not least, we have a plugins directory, which is actually empty. That's because we haven't added any plugins. So what is the difference between a plugin and a module, you might wonder? The difference is that modules are shipped with Elasticsearch, and plugins are a way for us to add custom functionality to Elasticsearch. That could be third-party plugins or ones developed by ourselves. Another difference is that these plugins can be removed, which is not the case for modules. And that's the directory layout of the Elasticsearch directory. In case you ever come across a variable named $es_home, then this is an environment variable that points to the root of the Elasticsearch directory. You might see that in a couple of places within the documentation, so that's just a small heads up for you.